Mr. Sinha, Mr. Raina, a lot of friends from my previous sector, including Mr. Krishna Kumar, a senior colleague. We worked together when he was in the SBI. It's a privilege to be here. I have come to a Dun & Bradstreet event after maybe a couple of years gap. I've enjoyed these meetings because it's always a thoughtful and a very connected audience, and it's useful for people like me in the government. It gives a good opportunity and a forum to communicate with people in the field, some of the nuances of policies that we are trying to implement. So thanks, Preeta, and thanks, Mr. Sinha, for this opportunity. What I will try and do in the 15 minutes or so that I have is to talk about what is it that the Government of India is trying in the Skill India mission. The ministry itself is skill development and entrepreneurship. The entrepreneurship part is something on which my ministry has not yet done very much. There are lots of initiatives of the government, other departments of the government, but there are things on the anvil on the entrepreneurship side. So maybe I'll spend 5-6 minutes talking about the entrepreneurship part, about 7-8 minutes talking about skilling. To begin with, the skills challenge is a challenge of numbers, it's a challenge of quality, and most importantly, it's a challenge of mindsets. I'll explain each of these. The numbers is actually, it's a complete sort of no-brainer. The demand for skilled labor, anecdotally, I think each one of us feels it, and there are enough estimates. The one that we rely on and which has been used in a lot of our policy documents is a 2012 study that the Ministry of Finance had commissioned and carried out by KPMG, which looked at 24 sectors of the Indian economy, accounting for close to about 95% of the economy in terms of both output and people. And the numbers they came up with in 2012, for a decade, for 2012 to 22, the incremental demand for skilled labor was projected at a little over 10 crores. And a subsequent revision done in 15-16, accounting for a lot of the subsequent changes, Internet of Things, Industry 4.0, hasn't really changed this number very much. So the demand, potential demand for skilled labor for a 10-year period has been projected, as I said, at something like 10 plus crores. So there is a huge demand for, or there should be a huge demand for skills and acquisition of skills. On the other side, there is enough formal numbers coming out of the Census of India, coming out of other NSSO estimates, which look at the supply of raw labor. One number that immediately sort of jumps out for attention is, given that about 47% of Indian children drop out of school at secondary level of education, and something like 2.5 crores is the number of people who enter the 15 plus age group per annum. At the very least, we are looking at something like 1.2, 1.3 crores of young Indians who've dropped out of schools, who will necessarily need to be skilled in some form if they have to make a living. So there is a huge demand for skilled labor. There is likely to be a very large supply of raw labor, calling therefore for a fairly large push at skill development. Now, as against this, the available capacity in the formal vocational education and training, and the jargon in the field that I'm in is VET, vocational education and training. The maximum that India can produce from the formal vocational education and training system is something like 1.6 million per annum. So as against the crores that I'm talking about, the best that India can do in terms of numbers is 1.6 million. And all of us know experientially, many of you are employers of the products of this system, and many others have experience in terms of dealing with them. Whatever we can say about quality and employability, the less said, the better. The truth is, a bulk of them are unemployable. So there is a challenge of numbers. There is a huge challenge of quality. Quality in terms of what they are taught, what they learn, and in terms of their own employability, including soft skills and other skills required to be a good working person. And the third and the most important difficulty in this entire space is skills acquisition is not at all aspirational. And this is not a problem peculiar to India, but I think it's a problem which is accentuated in India on account of history, on account of societal reasons, on account of culture. So it's not easy, notwithstanding individual examples of drivers carpenters and plumbers that you and I know, who perhaps make 40,000, 50,000 bucks a month. The bulk of India would rather wait for that one bank clerk in State Bank of India or one post in the Department of Customs, a white-collar clerical position in government or an organized sector is far, far higher in the preference of people than the best paying, skilled workers. So there is a whole aspirational issue to skill, and the Ministry of Skill Development and Entrepreneurship, set up by this government in the year 2014, launched the Skill India mission in 2015, and the objectives of the Skill India mission straight away come out of what I mentioned. The three purposes are increase scale, 2, enhance quality, and 3, do short, medium, and long-term steps for making acquisition of skills aspirational. This, in sum, is what we are attempting in the Skill India Challenge. The additional part is, and I think rightly, politics wants all of this done with speed. Now, the long-term answers to each of these three problems is very clear, but I think the difficulty that we grapple with on a daily basis is there is impatience, both on the political side and on, I guess, the side of the industry, and the side of service establishments, and the side of people, that all of this needs to be delivered with very high speed. The way this is being done is the capacity in the vocational education and training system is being increased. There has been a steep increase in the period 14 to 17. I'm not equally confident about the increase in its quality. We've had fairly large problems in some of the ITIs that have come up recently. And this is a sector where, if people don't know, interestingly, close to 80-85% of skill providers in India are in the private sector. They are not in the government sector. It's a sector which is very heavily funded by the government. So it's actually a very peculiar combination. There is massive public funding, but actual production of the services is by the private sector, and given poor contracting capacity of the state, typically in India, both of the central and state governments, and poor quality enforcement in the absence of statutory regulation, the net result has been large amounts of public expenditure, but typically very low value for money. So the long-term answer is very clear: enforcement of quality like it's done in the rest of the world. But the short-term answer that we are currently implementing is a huge increase in the capacity of training, not necessarily through the standard ITI system, but through short duration training programs, primarily created and affiliated to the NSDC ecosystem, the National Skill Development Corporation ecosystem. These are typically programs which are between 12 to 16 weeks. Almost no program goes beyond 5 months. So these are short duration training programs, and funded under a program called the PMKVY, the Prime Minister's Pradhan Mantri Kaushal Vikas Yojana, which takes the entire expenditure on account of training onto the Government of India's books and carried out through training providers affiliated to the NSDC, and quality and industry connect brought about through a new ecosystem of sector skill councils, which typically are representative of industry. We have at present 40 plus sector skill councils which determine content, which enforce quality, which do assessment and certification. And the aspirational part is there are a whole bunch of sort of cultural short-term things like brand ambassadors, but I think the more longer-lasting effort at aspirational aspects of skilling is coming through two initiatives. Typically earlier, skill development training and vocational education and training used to be a dead end. If a child went to an ITI program, he or she could seldom do or hope to do anything beyond. The breakthrough that we've been able to do is to link up with the formal mainstream educational system. We have now MOUs in place with 17 state boards of school education, with the National Institute of Open Schooling, and hopefully very soon with the CBSE, enabling an ITI pass out to be able to appear in school leaving exams and be able to get into a conventional education programs if he or she decides, but equally important, to enable that child to get into diploma programs and eventually to a degree in engineering if somebody is qualified enough, or to get into these more popular Bachelor of Vocational Education kind of programs. So one important part of addressing the aspirational side of skills is to open up educational pathways. And the other part, which is the more difficult part, is to work on labor markets and do whatever is necessary, the whole slew of measures there, to make it a reality that the Indian labor market will begin to provide a skill wage premium. And this is something by which most OECD countries eventually addressed the aspirational issue. So this in short is what we are attempting on the skilling side. In the balance 5 minutes that I have, I'd like to speak about the side of the ministry where, as I said, we have not been very active, partly because the entrepreneurship space is already a very crowded space in terms of government being present there. The earlier intervention referred to the various schemes like Startup India, Stand Up India, Mudra, a whole bunch of programs run by other parts of government. The sense that I have after having spent 6-7 months in this sector is that for the formal side of entrepreneurship, there are a number of programs. There will be, I'm sure, questions about how well these are working. That's a separate set of issues. But the part that we have decided internally to address is this entire space of the informal entrepreneurs, a bulk of whom are not entrepreneurs by choice. These are people who are entrepreneurs for completely lack of any other possibility, for completely lack of any other choice. And a whole bunch of them are what I think Manish Sabarwal in one of his Indian Express pieces called dwarfs. These are not youngsters, these are dwarfs because they remain stunted and lack the potential to grow due to a whole series of financial, economic, social, and regulatory constraints. So the effort of my ministry is essentially looking at this space in terms of two possible interventions. Given the likely pressures that will necessarily probably have started on account of the digital push and GST, a bulk of the informal sector in India will perish unless it becomes formal. What is it that can be done to enable some kind of hand-holding for this informal to become formal? And two, what is it that can be done to increase scale? And the paradox that I am struggling with is informal conversations with a bulk of these entrepreneurs clearly reveal that the state is almost always the villain. And the state here does not mean the state that most of us deal with. The average municipal inspector, the average food inspector, and the average sort of functionary of the state at the grassroots that the typical entrepreneur deals with is not a functionary that any of us wants to deal with. So the difficulty that I am sort of dealing with internally is, what is it that the state can do, and more specifically, the union government sitting so far away from a lot of these entrepreneurs who are spread across India, what is it that the government of India can do in this space which is actually helping, and not merely one more scheme which will create a whole bunch of bureaucracy and enormous amounts of paper generation. And the two things that strike me are, A, try and address the information asymmetry. And the best example that I can quote here is something some of you coming from Maharashtra may be familiar with. The kind of work that Deshpande of Diasra in Pune is doing, addressing information asymmetry in the form of, if you want to start a dry cleaning shop in the city of Virudhunagar in Tamil Nadu, these are the 28 interfaces with the state. The municipal body needs to give you ABC license. The police guy needs to give you EFGH license. The district administration needs to give you this. Here are the forms in the local language, customized for, say, 200, 300, 400 cities of India, 30, 40 occupations, where formally certified by the state a list of clear interfaces and the hoops through which entrepreneurs have to jump to be able to set up shop. And in the same information booklet, can we just put together the 5,000 existing schemes without starting a new one? So that's the kind of attempt we are on. We are currently piloting it in 2 cities for 5 occupations, and hopefully by about middle of next year, we hope to sort of be able to scale this. And the second part that we intend doing is to take this component called recognition of prior learning, which is an important part of the PM's agenda on skilling. Each of our conversations with the PM have typically ended with the PM expressing considerable dissatisfaction about not doing enough to recognize the enormous amount of skill that exists in a whole bunch of people who work for you, but who are not formally recognized, who are not formally certified, who need perhaps 20, 30 hours of upskilling and some soft skills and a certificate to make them mobile and make them employable. This is what we are attempting in the entrepreneurship side, and hopefully with cooperation of a large number of SMEs of the kind that are present here, we hope to take this forward. Thank you.